Just before you listen to today's episode, this is a quick message to remind you that if you like what you hear, you can help support History Hack, which is run entirely by volunteers using our Patreon account. There are links on all of our episodes, or if a subscription is not your thing, you can also now drop us a line on Ko-fi, which is just the equivalent of buying us a drink. So if you hear an episode, you like it, and you want to chip in just once, then you can do that too. Thank you. Good morning and welcome to another episode of History Hack. The sun is shining. We're remarkably chipper considering we're into our second week of bulk recording, and we're chipper because we're going medieval today, aren't we, Beth?
We are, and we're joined today by Kathryn Warner. Kathryn has 2 degrees in medieval history from the University of Manchester, and she's considered a foremost expert on Edward II, all things Edward II. She had an article published on him in the English Historical Review. She also has carved a very strong online presence for him with a website and Facebook page as well. But she's also an expert on the wider 14th century. And her latest book, which we're talking about today, is called John of Gaunt, Son of One King, Father of Another. So, Kathryn, welcome to History Hack.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here and to have the chance to talk to you today.
Oh, this is really good. So John of Gaunt, I know the name, but this is not our period. So we are essentially blank slates, idiots for you to talk to today about this subject. So John of Gaunt is in Shakespeare's Richard II, which covers his later life. Obviously, Beth will be well averse with that because she actually likes Shakespeare. I'm a Marlowe girl myself. So let's go back to the beginning and find out more about him at the start. So who are his parents and where was he born?
Okay, so John of Gaunt's father was Edward III, who was King of England from 1327 to 1377. And his mother was Philippa of Hainaut, who was the daughter of the Count of Hainaut and Holland in modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. And she was also the niece of King Philip VI of France. Philippa and Edward married in 1328, and they had 12 children between 1330 and 1355. 5 daughters and 7 sons. John of Gaunt was the 6th of their 12 children. He was actually their 4th son, though one of his older brothers, the 2nd son of King Edward and Queen Philippa, William of Hatfield, died in infancy when he was, just a few weeks old. So John of Gaunt was the 3rd son of the royal couple who lived into adulthood.
Looks completely shell-shocked by the idea of 12.
Well, I mean, that is a hell of a reproductive family.
Well, yeah, Edward III's father, Edward II, was the youngest of at least 14 children and possibly as many as 16. It just makes you cringe, doesn't it?
It does. And it's like, this is what happens when there's no Netflix. I mean, like, Beth spends her time right now binging Grey's Anatomy, as do I. Yeah. And what else would we do if that wasn't available to us, I guess?
Absolutely. We don't have any reliable contraception. I mean, what can you do?
Yeah.
So Edward III claimed the throne of France in 1337, the throne that was currently occupied by his wife's uncle, Philip VI of France. And he spent most of the period from 1338 to 1340 outside his kingdom, searching for allies against the French among the counts and dukes of the Low Countries in modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. So Queen Philippa went with him, and so did a couple of their daughters. And in 1338, Queen Philippa gave birth to one of her sons in Antwerp, her 3rd son. And then on the 6th of March, 1340, she gave birth to her next child in the town of Ghent, which was then in the Duchy of Brabant and is now in Belgium. So this was John of Gaunt, her 6th child and 4th son. So correctly, we should really call John of Gaunt John of Ghent after his birthplace. But in the 14th century in England, the town of Ghent was always called Gaunt. And significantly, it was also called Gaunt a couple of centuries later during Shakespeare's lifetime. So Shakespeare always calls John of Ghent John of Gaunt. So it's not really correct. I mean, I would would prefer to call him by, the more accurate John of Ghent, but he's so extremely well known under the name John of Gaunt. It kind of seems ridiculous that we would change it now. But yeah, he was actually born in modern day Belgium.
And obviously, as you mentioned, one of very, very many children. But he's the 3rd son as well, as you say. Obviously, the 4th son born, but the 3rd who grows up.
Yeah.
Was he ever destined to have a great role from childhood? Because usually you hear of 2nd sons, 3rd sons, 4th sons. They kind of filter away.
Son a priest, isn't it? Isn't it the 3rd son you give to the church?
Yeah. It's perhaps quite surprising that none of the many children of Edward III and Queen Philippa actually did join the church, but I think under normal circumstances that no, we wouldn't have expected a really great destiny for the third son of the king. But in 1359, John's father, Edward III, arranged a marriage for him, which actually was kind of catapulted him into great wealth and influence. So John was married to his cousin, or his slightly distant cousin, Blanche of Lancaster. At that time, John was 19, Blanche was probably 17. She was the younger daughter and co-heir of the first Duke of Lancaster, Henry of Grosmont. Her father died in 1361, and then in 1362, her older sister Maud, the Duchess of Bavaria, also died. And then this meant that the entire Lancastrian inheritance passed to Blanche, and therefore also to her husband, John of Gaunt. And the Lancasters owned lands, castles and manors in no fewer than 34 English counties, and also right across Wales. This gave John of Gaunt an income of something like £12,000 a year, which actually made him the richest man in England at the time. And he was probably just about the richest man in England in the entire 14th century, or if not the richest, then certainly one of the 2 or 3 richest. By way of comparison, the brother closest to him in age, Edmund of Langley, who was just 15 months younger, had an annual income of only £500. Oh, wow. So this great wealth was always kind of going to make John of Gaunt very influential. He had an enormous household and an enormous retinue, probably actually a lot wealthier and more influential than his father had ever intended, because the intention was that his wife Blanche was going to share the inheritance with her older sister Maud, but Maud died childless in her early 20s. So unexpectedly, John got the entire Lancastrian inheritance.
He spends time in the military. Doesn't have a glowing career, does he? Unlike his brothers.
He's not famous for his military career. That's absolutely certain. But he did actually see military action for the first time at the age of only 10.
Wow.
In 1350. This was at the naval battle of Winchelsea, which is also called the Spaniards on the Sea. So basically, the situation was that there was this partly Spanish and partly French nobleman called Carlos de la Cerda, who was a notorious pirate who used to prey on merchants in the English Channel, rob all their goods and then throw them overboard to drown. Character. And Edward III decided to get revenge on Carlos de la Cerda and lay in wait for him with his fleet and engaged him in battle in August 1350. So John of Gaunt was only 10 years and a few months old at this time, and there's evidence that he was on the same boat as his eldest brother, Edward of Woodstock, the Prince of Wales. He actually did see military engagement at the age of only 10. And a few years later, he also fought in Spain with his eldest brother, the Prince of Wales. So he took part in the Battle of Nájera in Spain in 1367, when they helped Pedro, King of Castile and Leon, defeat his illegitimate half-brother, Enrique of Trastamara. So this was another military success that John of Gaunt definitely had. But apart, his eldest brother, the Prince of Wales, of course, was incredibly famous for his great military victories, especially at Poitiers in 1356. John's other brothers actually were not particularly famous as warriors. For example, his brother Edmund of Langley, who was just slightly younger than he was, led a military expedition to Portugal in the early 1380s and proved so disastrous as a military leader that the soldiers mutinied against him. So arguably John was better than at least some of his brothers, we could say at least.
And so obviously we know that John's oldest brother, Edward, is the Prince of Wales. He's the heir to the throne and so on, but he dies, doesn't he? He leaves his own young child, who becomes Richard II at 10 years old. So when he obviously comes to the throne, he's not in a position to make any sort of decision. He's 10 years old. He'd rather be doing what 10-year-olds do. So he takes the place of regent, doesn't he, John? And he makes some poor decisions that, among other things, do lead to things like the peasants' revolt and so on. What other kind of decisions did he make in his time as regent? Is there anything that we would recognise now in the modern day?
Right, yeah, so John's father, Edward III, died in 1377, and John's eldest brother, the Prince of Wales, had picked up some kind of recurring disease when they'd fought in Spain a few years earlier. And although he was born as heir to the throne all the way back in 1330, he died almost a year before his father. And yes, as you say, John's 10-year-old nephew, Richard II, then comes to the throne. So although a lot of foreign observers did believe and state that John of Gaunt was made sole regent for his nephew, that's not actually the case. He was just simply a member of a regency council that was intended to rule for the 10-year-old king, which was usually the case in England, at least in the 14th century. For example, when Edward III became king in 1327, he was only 14. And again, a regency council consisting of several earls, barons, and bishops was appointed to reign for him. So this was usually what happened in England in the 14th century, though it's probably reasonable to say that Gaunt was the most powerful man in England at the time, because he was the king's eldest uncle. He was the eldest surviving son of the late king. And some of the men who were on the Regency Council were friends, supporters, retainers, or adherents of his. But, you know, oddly enough, it's surprisingly difficult to identify any really major decisions that John of Gaunt made in this period, in the late 1370s, when he was on the Regency Council. So after Richard II was crowned king at Westminster Abbey in July 1377, it actually seems that Gaunt didn't even stay in London. He actually went north to Yorkshire and just went hunting, which, you know, seems really surprising. And because there was like a council making decisions, and it was and all the decisions were recorded as part of that council, it's quite hard to identify what Gaunt himself was actually doing at this time. Arguably, the worst decision that was made was when Parliament levied the poll tax in November 1380, which led directly to the Peasants' Revolt a few months later. But John of Gaunt wasn't actually present at that Parliament that made the decision. So I think it's reasonable to say that he was grossly unpopular at this time. I mean, especially in London. I think this has a lot to do with the fact that he was so enormously rich and influential, seen as overbearing. And because his father, Edward III, had been quite, you know, senile and incapable of governing the last few years of his life, John had been wielding a lot of influence, which some people thought was perhaps quite sinister. Other people thought that perhaps he had designs on his young nephew's throne, that as the wealthy Duke of Lancaster and as an adult, he might try to take the throne. I mean, you know, of course he didn't. And he was particularly unpopular in London because in 1376, he'd had this enormous quarrel with the Bishop of London, William Courtenay, who was actually a kinsman of Gaunt, because he was descended from Edward I. And Gaunt had threatened to drag Courtenay out of his palace by his hair. So, yeah. So this made Gaunt really unpopular among the Londoners. And then, of course, we see the consequences of this in June 1381, when the revolting peasants poured into London and destroyed Gaunt's palace of the Savoy. And luckily for John, he wasn't anywhere near London at the time. He was in the far north of England, which almost certainly saved his life.
I love it that he is essentially like a little Boris Johnson running around in that. There's women everywhere, isn't there? So he had a substantial love life, married 3 times, multiple affairs as well. He's a boy.
Yeah, he was a bit of a player. I mean, you know, I think that's reasonable to say. One chronicler called him a great fornicator.
Oh, that's the kind of thing I think if you're a medieval guy, you want that on your headstone.
Yeah, I mean, that's it gives you a great...
Behold, I am the great fornicator.
Yes, I'll have it put on all my business cards, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure we could entirely say he had multiple affairs. I mean, the only mistress we know that he really had for a long time was the woman who later became his third wife, Katherine Swynford. One chronicler from the Low Countries, Jean Froissart, does say that John fathered an illegitimate daughter called Blanche, possibly named after his first wife. And, you know, this is certainly possible, but interestingly enough, there's no actual other evidence of it. I think almost certainly as a nobleman, the king's son, the most powerful and wealthy man in England, he wasn't going to have any difficulties finding willing women to sleep with him, although the evidence that he was really putting it about quite a lot is somewhat lacking. So yes, he married 3 times, as I said a few minutes ago. His first wife was the great heiress who made him incredibly wealthy for the last 30 years of his life. She died at the age of only 26. And then 3 years later, John married Costanza of Castile, whose father, King Pedro, was the King of Castile and Leon. So they married when John was 31 and Costanza was only 17. But probably only a few months after he married Costanza, he began this long-term and very famous relationship with his mistress, Katherine Swynford, who was the widow of a knight from Lincolnshire called Sir Hugh Swynford. And during the 1370s, while John was married to Costanza, Katherine gave birth to 4 of John's children, the Beauforts. Duchess Costanza died in 1394, and just under 2 years later, John married his long-term mistress, Katherine, made her the Duchess of Lancaster, and a year later, their 4 Beaufort children were also legitimised. And as I'm sure you know, their Beaufort descendants were to play a massive role in England in the 15th century during the Wars of the Roses.
And it's through his second wife. I remember reading in your book here, he has a little bit of a stab, I would say, at some sort of monarchist himself, because he tries to claim the kingdom of Castile through his second wife, doesn't he?
Yes, right. So his father-in-law, King Pedro, was defeated in battle and stabbed to death in 1369 by his illegitimate half-brother, Enrique of Trastamara, who then made himself King of Castile. So John's second wife, Costanza, was the eldest surviving daughter and therefore the heir of King Pedro. And John and lots of other people thought that therefore he should be King of Castile by right of his wife. The problem was, of course, that the throne was now occupied by her illegitimate half-uncle Enrique, and then later by her cousin Juan. But John of Gaunt, he tried for years to get Parliament to give him funding to take an expedition to Castile so that he could claim the throne in more than name only. He was always recognised in England as King of Castile. He always called himself King of Castile in all his letters. But he had, until 1386, he'd never even, kind of like set foot in his kingdom, except for fighting on King Pedro's behalf many years before. So in 1386, he finally gained the funding from Parliament to take an expedition to Castile. He, Costanza and several of John's children went off there. And he spent 3 years there, or a little over 3 years there. But unfortunately, it never happened. He never managed to take the throne from his wife's cousin, King Juan. So ultimately, what the two men decided was that John and Costanza's daughter, Catherine of Lancaster, or Catalina, perhaps we could call her, would marry her cousin, King Juan's son, Enrique. And some years later, she became Queen Consort of Castile. And she and her husband, Enrique III, had a son who was the next King of Castile, and he united the two rival branches of the Castilian royal family. So it never happened that John of Gaunt became King of Castile, despite his calling himself by that title for many years. But he did live long enough to see his daughter become the Queen Consort of Castile. So perhaps that was some minor consolation.
Yeah. If you can't do it, put your kid there instead.
So he was also a good friend and patron of the poet Geoffrey Chaucer. Do we know if he had any sort of influence on the work that he completed?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point, isn't it? Because Geoffrey Chaucer's wife, Philippa, was actually the sister of John of Gaunt's long-term mistress and later his third wife, Katherine Swynford. So they were really connected by family. And Geoffrey and Philippa's son, Thomas Chaucer, who was born in about 1367, later served in John's retinue. Geoffrey Chaucer himself, as a young man, had served in the retinue of one of John's brothers, his older brother, Lionel. So we know that they knew each other pretty well for many years. And Chaucer's first long work was called The Book of the Duchess, and this was written in the aftermath of the death of John's first wife, Blanche, the Duchess of Lancaster. And in the work, Chaucer has John expressing heartfelt emotions for his wife and for her, her death at a young age. But of course, this isn't actually John's diary. It's a piece of literature that was written by Chaucer, and it may be based on John's own feelings, but we don't know that for sure. I think sometimes John's influence on the Book of the Duchess has been overstated. Like we don't know, and we can't know for sure that Chaucer was writing John's own feelings. He might well have done. John might well have, loved Blanche of Lancaster very deeply and grieved for her very deeply. But, I think we have to remember it wasn't actually written by John himself. It's just Chaucer is putting words in John's mouth that may be true, but we don't know that.
And as we sort of come to the end of John's life, what happens to him? Where does he end up? Because he ends up in one of his properties again, doesn't he, towards the end of his life?
Yeah, so it seems to me that after John returned to England from Castile after failing to claim the throne, that he did his utmost to build a good relationship with his nephew, Richard II. They did have quite a difficult and turbulent relationship for many years. But in 1390, Richard made John Duke of Aquitaine, for example. And John and his son Henry of Lancaster, who Shakespeare calls Henry of Bolingbroke after his birthplace in Lincolnshire, they seem to have done their best to build good relations with Richard. But in 1398, as a lot of people will know from reading or seeing a performance of Shakespeare's play Richard II, Richard exiled John's son Henry from England for 10 years in the autumn of 1398. And I'm pretty sure that this caused John an awful lot of distress, that his eldest son and his heir had to go abroad into exile, and for all his years of loyalty and his attempts to build good relations with Richard II, that he hadn't been able to prevent his nephew from exiling his son. So it seems that in the last few months of John's life that he became quite seriously ill, and he retreated to Leicester Castle, one of the many castles that he had across England and Wales. And yes, he stayed there for the last few months of his life, and he died there on the 3rd of February, 1399, which was a month before his 59th birthday. So we don't know for sure what killed John, because medieval chroniclers only rarely gave us the cause of death. One chronicler writing half a century later claimed that John died of a sexually transmitted disease, which may or may not be true. I tend to think that it probably isn't. And yes, on the day John died, he managed to dictate a very, very long will, leaving some of his numerous items to his nephew and lots of his glorious, valuable possessions to his wife, Katherine, and to all 8 of his living children who were still alive in 1399.
What is the height, would you say? Like, can you try and put into context for us his influence during his lifetime?
Yeah, I suppose just because while Richard II was underage and he didn't take over the governance of his kingdom until he was 22, John just was the richest man in England. He had a lot of influence over Parliament. He had an enormous household. It wasn't just like the influence that he himself was wielding. He just had the kind of ability to put his own men or his own friends into supporters into key positions to make decisions for him. So I mean, he was the second man in the realm after Richard II.
I'm getting like a Thomas Cromwell vibe off of him in the reign of Henry VIII. It's kind of like a similar level of influence and power. Is that right?
Yes, I don't know much about Thomas Cromwell, but I suppose, you can kind of see John of Gaunt as, like the power behind the throne. And I think it's also quite telling that during the 3 years he was away from England from 1386 to 1389, things went very badly wrong for Richard II. So John's youngest brother, Thomas of Woodstock, the Duke of Gloucester, Edward III's youngest son, and a group of his allies actually came very close to deposing Richard II during the Merciless Parliament, as it was called, and they exiled or executed many of Richard II's friends. So I think that, without John of Gaunt's steadying influence, and then yes, things went wrong for Richard II, and his reign in the late 1380s became very turbulent and then later became calmer after Gaunt returned to England.
I suppose so. For me personally, I didn't know much about John of Gaunt's life while he was alive and what he did as you say, his role as regent and his military career and so on. But for me, reading your book and what I know about him, John's legacy doesn't necessarily lie in what he did when he was alive.
Right.
His legacy comes from his children and the roles they play. As you say, he had many children, 4 with his mistress and many others with his first wives and so on. And they go on to play extremely significant roles in the history of not just England, but Europe as well.
Absolutely.
Particularly, obviously, his son Henry, with Henry Bolingbroke and what leads from that and so on. So what kind of roles do they play and how important do they become for what is to come in the future?
Right, so shortly after John died, Richard II made this monumental decision to exile Henry Bolingbroke from England for life and confiscated the entire enormous Lancastrian inheritance. So Henry Bolingbroke wasn't the kind of man who was going to accept this, and a few months later he came back to England, raised an army, and ultimately ended up deposing Richard II and becoming Henry IV of England in September 1399. So within 8 months of John of Gaunt's death, his son had made himself King of England. Henry IV's son was, of course, Henry V of Agincourt fame. And John's eldest daughter, Philippa, married the King of Portugal in 1387. Her eldest son, Duarte, became King of Portugal, succeeding his father. And John's descendants, his grandchildren and their children, had a massive influence in the history of Portugal, kind of moving from what was just a small and not very significant nation into becoming like a great maritime and colonial power over the next few decades and centuries. And John's daughter Katherine, or Catalina, the Queen Consort of Castile, she was the mother of another king of Castile, Enrique III. He was the father of the great Isabel the Catholic, the Queen Regnant of Castile, who's famous for capturing Granada in 1492, for example, starting the Spanish Inquisition. She was John of Gaunt's great-granddaughter. So Gaunt was, as well as being the father of a king of England, was the grandfather of 3 kings: Henry V of England, Duarte I of Portugal, and Enrique III of Castile. And yes, his Beaufort descendants, the children he had with Catherine Swynford, also played a massive role during the Wars of the Roses. So Henry VII, the first Tudor King of England, was one of John's descendants via his great-granddaughter Margaret Beaufort, for example. So he had a massive influence, or rather his descendants had a massive influence on several countries during the 15th century and, of course, the centuries to come as well.
Kathryn, tell us again, what's the name of the book and where can people get hold of it?
So my book is called John of Gaunt, Son of One King, Father of Another, and it's available from Amazon or all good online bookshops, and I hope your local bookshop as well.
Yeah, do support your local bookshops. We will, of course, put it on the History Hack bookshop so people can get it. Do buy it via that, because not only does Kathryn get a cut, we get a cut, the publishers get a cut, Amazon don't get anything, and everybody's happy.
It's a beautiful cover as well, so will look lovely on your shelves.
Beth is rather excited by it. Thank you so much for coming on to share the story with us. We look forward to putting this out there so more people can get to know about John of Gaunt.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been lovely to talk to you today.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great